am Rob, creator of the Lair of Omnisci, and I'm kind of doing a backwards glance at some of my earliest gaming memories. Preserving them, just in case someday I can't, but in this case, I think sometimes it's pretty helpful to know where you've come from, to see, where you're going. Just to look at the starting point and track how much progress you've made and all those things. And my earliest memories are actually fairly easy to track. They're actually fairly vivid. Some of my most favorite memories come from gaming in one way, shape, or form. The very first group I ever had, just setting aside things like playing with my brothers, that didn't go anywhere. Neither of them really ended up with much of a passion for gaming. And to be honest, I was still in the infancy of my skills too, so can't entirely blame them. I could tell a much better story now that might have had a chance of at least lasting a couple of sessions. But what I do remember very vividly was my very first group. And not everybody, I have a hard time sometimes conjuring some of the faces of the players in mind, because the group was kind of up and down. We had some people who, stood out really vividly, but we were playing with a fairly large group when I was introduced. For one thing, the thing that was really memorable is, back in those days, I didn't really visit a lot of other people's places. Being in high school, having a limited number of friends because I was pretty introverted. But also the distances. I didn't have a car. Anywhere I'd go, I'd have to be, basically brought there by my father. So that worked against me in a lot of things. But for this game, he took me to the games, which I still remember, and it was really cool being in somebody else's place and getting to know the people around and just trying to do this while learning how to play Dungeons and Dragons. This was playing advanced Dungeons and Dragons, mind you. I'd only ever before really seen the basic Dungeons and Dragons. And back then, I obviously I wasn't really as well versed in game systems and game theory as I am today. But I did get a copy of the player's handbook loaned to me so that I could read through. And the character they wanted me to play was a cleric, as so many people do when they join a new group. Back in the day, especially, the group needs a healer. That's just kind of the balance expected in a gaming group. So if you are new to a group and they don't have one, you're going to be playing the cleric. So I did. I was handed a cleric. I still have the character. I still have that character sheet, as a matter of fact. It's one of the very few character sheets I have that are not in my own handwriting. So it's easy to tell. It's also very old, written on loose leaf paper. But I mean, the basic format is there: statistics and saving throws, hit points, armor class, all of that. One of these days I'll present that again. I've shown it once or twice, but I really have to do a good scan of it. I do have a box that has all my oldest and most cherished D&D characters. There's a lot of chaff in there too that should probably be weeded out, but that character was my very first. The only thing I did for that character on my own is I gave him the name, I gave him eye color, hair color. I think I decided weight and stuff too. He wasn't particularly strong. He was quite wise. The name that I picked, because when I was there, I was very interested in religion, and I would end up going to a seminary the next year for my schooling. So the name I picked was Crosstula. Obviously, the cross Christianity, I associated that pretty heavily. It didn't hurt that the concept for clerics was patterned after religious warriors who might be banned from shedding blood, which is why they couldn't use edged weapons. All the cool swords and stuff, clerics couldn't use. And looking back, most of those non-edged weapons kind of sucked. They definitely put you in a position way below warriors in terms of importance and the cool things that you could do, unless your dungeon master really stepped forward to try to find you some interesting things to get a hold of. I never did with that character. He finished off with a mace +2, which was the best weapon we'd ever found that he could use. Since we went through a lot of the classic modules, that does say something about how the treasure from those modules were. Tons and tons and tons of loot, but you'd see the same things over and over again. I think we found 2 swords of sharpness, for instance, but never a better mace than a mace +2. Not even a mace of disruption or anything. No, it's mace +2. His armor was also pretty pedestrian. I think I ended up with chainmail +2. And maybe a +1 shield. I was not a powerhouse by any stretch of the imagination. I joined the campaign while it was in progression, but fairly early on. I think I started at 4th or 5th level, which as a cleric was useful because I had a heaping helping of those initial spells. And because the clerics had a smaller spell list than than wizards and the like, I just made a listing of all the different spells and ticked off the ones that I'd memorized, and I just about erased a bald patch right next to Cure Light Wounds. Yeah. I was a healing battery. There was no question about it. It's not that I wasn't asked to roleplay or anything like that. I did get to say my piece, but I had a function, and that was to buff them up a little bit, but mostly to cure wounds. To note my role, it's actually pretty useful to know the rest of the group, and if anybody ever watches this and was a part of that original group, please bear in mind, this was in the 80s. As I do this now, this is 2022. So a long time has passed, and my memory is muddled. So there are some that I clearly remember. If I don't clearly remember details about your character, I'm sorry. I'm just, obviously I fixated on my friend and the major members of the group. So, playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and I'm handed a vanilla cleric. I don't even remember if I was allowed to pick the alignment. I think Lawful Good was on my sheet already. So, I pretty much had my place. This was playing fairly generic D&D. I didn't have a god. I just followed the light. And that even never got spoken of, really. So, I did technically have a religion. I was a cleric, but it never came up. World building wasn't something that we really discussed or did anything with. It was literally going module to module to module to module. What a lot of people might assume with the behavior of murder hobos, but we really weren't. Generally, our characters were on the heroic side. We didn't cause a great deal of problems, with a few minor exceptions here and there. We didn't really revel in being, free to raise havoc across the countryside. We were generally pretty decent people. My character was extremely moral. I can't remember ever doing anything that was even shades of gray. My character was effectively a saint. But a lot of that is based on how those adventure modules were set up. There was no temptation. There was really no effort or struggle to being good. Bad things were out there. They needed to be defeated. I wouldn't be the one defeating them. I would be backing up my group who would be defeating the evil. But, that's basically how it went. The other members of the group, though. First of all, for the person whose house we were playing at, that person, the eldest of the lot, and he had brothers that we were playing with too. The eldest he played a cavalier. So we were using Unearthed Arcana, but he also was the dungeon master half the time. And he was pretty good. I mean, we were running modules. So we were running modules at a fairly vanilla level without any real world baked in. No kings, no dukes, no earls, no nothing that really changed or dictated what we did. So he ran the game half the time. this also gave the other dungeon master, who played the other dungeon master played the magic user. So half the time we had a magic user, and half the time we had a cavalier. And I'm not going to say their characters were rather buffed. I'm sure they were well compensated while they were dungeon mastering, and the cavalier was devastating. If you've actually ever read Unearthed Arcana, the cavalier has several huge bonuses. Although it takes him a while to level up, you know, eventually he had perfect stats, or he would come to get perfect stats in his physical garb. So he had the 1800 strength naturally. He had an 18 constitution, 18 dexterity. I think he actually, I can't remember if there were provisions to go beyond that, but he was, you know, amazing in a fight. Absolutely. And if he was on a horse, absolutely amazing. Just tremendous. The magic user, he played a classic magic user. Big spells when he needed them, small spells for quality of life purposes. He really was my first experience with playing with a cerebral player who relished the idea of having this magical toolbox and employing it. And he was quite good at it. Again, I didn't have a lot to judge that on back in the time, but there aren't a whole lot of situations I remember he was completely flat out and unable to do anything, which was a trap that magic users could get into quite easily, especially if you were running these modules that featured larger dungeons. You could run out of spells fairly quickly. I do remember, obviously, there are role-playing scenarios in those engagements. Both of those players generally tended to stay back and let the others role-play those scenarios. I think it could be partially Dungeon Master just detachment. I think another part was they'd already read the modules, so they let us do more of the role-play in those scenarios. And I have to be kind of grateful for that. It was nice of them to do so, and yet they were both still kind of players. They were on our side. It was a good working relationship, I think. Now, the classmate I had, the only person who was the same age as me, was playing a samurai, and this was my first experience with Oriental adventures. I did not read this book. I did not have an option to play any characters out of it, and I will be completely and utterly honest and transparent. I've never read this thing all the way through. I've read excerpts, sure. I've read a few things that were directed to me, but I don't share the fascination with the mythical Oriental culture. Or at least I didn't back then. Later on, I got to appreciate it a lot more. Both the actual historical evidence, mostly through the lens of video games that showed me things like, you know, Dynasty Warriors and Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and the curiosity those games evoked in me caused me to go in and look at the historical facts as much as the history of that time is factual. Obviously, to the victor goes the ability to write the history books, so yeah, I did what I could. Nobody can get an actual factual representation. Everything is going to be anecdotal, or there are some facts that you can get, but ultimately, most of the things that led to the development of things like this rely heavily on folklore, superstition, and revisionist history. But this didn't really interest me all that much. It did obviously interest the people who were playing, because we had a samurai, because as I said, the player who was a classmate of mine really had some touchstones that he really, really liked, and samurai were one of them. He thought samurai were the coolest. Now, I come from a fairly culturally deprived place. The tiny little town in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, far away from any city, ethnically homogenous. There's very little blending pot up there, or there wasn't back in the day. So how he got access to a lot of knowledge about ninjas and samurais, I don't know. Probably watching movies. There were some movies that had stuff like that. I didn't see those movies. Also, two of the youngsters in the group, and they were pretty young. I myself at the time was Oh Lord, 14? 14. There were kids who were younger. I believe 9 and up. I could be wrong. Could have been even younger. And 2 of them were playing ninjas. Sort of. I mean, they belonged to a ninja clan, if I remember right. One of them was a Bushai, though. He was a warrior. And a pretty darn good one, too. He'd have to be to do anything alongside of a cavalier and a samurai. He participated in the fights. No real personality that I remember, except that he and... don't even remember if it was his brother. But his brother was playing more of a Yakuza style. So, underworld. And was basically the fixer that we might have for anything that we needed socially, quite honestly. Those were skills that the rest of us didn't really have or employ very much. Even my character, I didn't have the greatest charisma, and I really wasn't secure enough in my roleplay at the time to say, hey, I'm a cleric, I can be the mouthpiece of this group, and I can do great things for us. He did. So we had these different characters. We also had a ranger, who was played by I believe it was a guy a little older than me. Junior if I was in my freshman year, or maybe a sophomore. But he had very little personality that I can remember. I remember that he was there. We didn't have any girls in the group. Not too surprising considering the time and the place. I just remember he shot arrows. I don't remember him ever casting a spell. I don't remember him ever really doing anything of any great note. Left me with a rather sour impression of what rangers were. And I don't know if he decided to be a ranger based on token, where the rangers are pretty cool. In Dungeons & Dragons, the rangers were, not the greatest. Weren't very powerful, I mean, fighters even had some advantages that rangers would be jealous of. But they were there, so he was playing one. And if I remember, you had to qualify to be a ranger with decent stats, so he must have had pretty good stats. During this game, nobody really died. That was another thing. When I was playing, I really did learn a lot of my DMing style in the early days from this group. As far as I remember, that recounting, by the way, is the players that were in there. That's as much as I can remember at the moment. There may have been 1 or 2 others, but they didn't really shine tremendously to the point that I would remember, which I feel kind of bad about. I have a feeling there was still somebody else in there, but I can't recall. But the clutch of all these different people were really my very first gaming group. And I learned some really, really valuable lessons from this group. But I did learn a few things right away. Number 1 was my role. I was the heal bot. I would be expected to stay along with people, keep everybody alive. If I was going to contribute to something, it had better be in a way that wasn't going to detract from my ability to heal. The spell Spiritual Hammer, for instance. I got to be fairly familiar with that. Being able to have a weapon go and thunk people while I went around and healed people worked pretty well in the few fights that I actually had any impact in. Moving up and swinging along with my mace, didn't have a lot of strength, and clerics didn't have a great attacking table, so if it was anything more than the weakest dungeon fodder, it wasn't all that effective. I do remember that, feeling like I was pretty useless most of the time. This was my very first character that I played to any extent, and I stuck with it because I loved the group, and some of those early modules were really cool. There are some that stand out in my mind, clearly, and there are stories to be told out of that, but that's not really the focus on this. I just kind of wanted to appreciate how those different characters really did kind of change my perception on this whole role-playing thing. Because remember, before this, I had the red box. So what were the characters that I knew? I knew fighter, magic user, thief, cleric, elf, dwarf, magic user. That was it. It's Dungeons and Dragons. Now I'm playing a game where you can be an elven fighter. You could be a half-elf ranger. And I couldn't tell you what rules we chose to use and which ones we didn't. As we adventured, our characters basically gained a level every module. So by the time we were done, my character was up there a bit. I can't remember at what point I bowed out, and I think that was through graduation. And it was... we went through several classic ones. Not all of them in one night. Most of them took several sessions to get through. I remember Ravenloft took us quite a while. We did Drums on Fire Mountain. That was an interesting game. I think we did Isle of the Ape. That was an interesting game. In that, it really was really frustrating, honestly, because there was really little for me to do. There were fights, which I was told to stay out of. This is one of the early ones we did. And we didn't have miniatures beyond just some very basic ones. There really wasn't anything to give a sense of the scope of that adventure. So I was trying to grasp onto it, and I really didn't get much of that. Honestly, the first and most vivid one I remember from that group was Ravenloft, because Ravenloft had a lot of things in it that really set the mood and got you to feel like you were in this haunted land, and then eventually this cursed castle with danger everywhere, literally everywhere, under your feet, above you, at either side. Death could come. And you know, Isle of the Ape I didn't care for particularly. I was glad to put that one behind us. Saber River, that was nasty. River Death, that was incredibly nasty. Now, looking back on some of these, I've actually managed to collect some of those old modules that I had played, and I read through them, and not a lot of connection really comes up with my remembrances and those modules, which tells me a couple of things. Number one, they might have taken some liberties when they ran those games. We played in a... It wasn't the most narrative of styles, but I appreciate that the game masters actually did have their own narrative flair that they added. There were some pretty halfway decent role-playing sessions, for instance. They were not afraid to ad-lib in areas. For instance, there was one, I can't remember if it was Drums on Fire Mountain or what. The entire opening scenario is you are traveling to an island by water, and you get attacked midway through by a kraken. Maybe it was a giant octopus, but I thought it was a kraken. And we fought it off and killed it. And we looted its treasure, and we decided we were going to turn around and give a pass on the rest of the adventure because we had all this treasure. We had to identify it, we had to sort it out before we took that next step to go into the dungeon, or to go to the island. And apparently we hadn't been gone that far into the journey when we made this decision. So it made sense. Nobody was really railing against this decision to turn around. And so the DMs basically let us do it. We went back, and we had quite a little adventure while we were there. That's also a story I've told on the Lair of Omnicide before. But, just... it's the one place my character did something that could be considered not good. I accidentally killed another player character because the DM was feeling a little evil at the time. And I was trying to create a distraction and accidentally killed our wizard, our magic user. So I felt bad about that. But I got him resurrected, so that was important. But yeah, there was some PvP chaos that went on in there and actually led to the death of the samurai for the first time. So, but that was all a sidebar. And it was fun. And I really did learn that you gotta be flexible. What happens in the course of an adventure is not what's on your notes, necessarily. And it's not what's printed before you in a module. Sometimes you have to make do. And afterwards, I talked to the dungeon master, and I asked him, you know, was that town in the module? No. It turns out he had his own town that he had in reserve. If he needed a town or a city, he could bring people back to this stock city that he had. And with all the quirks of a teenager back in the D&D age. For instance, the bar, was owned by a storm giant, and the bouncer was a mastodon, and the stools up to the bar were 12 feet tall. Okay. And they had a bank with security and just... There was some quirks, definite quirks, but since then, I have stock towns now. If anybody wanted to say, hey, I want to play Dungeons and Dragons, I'd be fine. I have a town to start, ready to go. Make up your characters, I'll put them in play, and we can go. And having stock supplies like that is really useful for a game master. So I learned that. Having stuff in your pocket, in your toolbox, when you're ready to run, is incredibly useful and shows the breadth and depth of experience that it does for you. Of course, along with things like that, I learned a lot of the tropes of Dungeons and Dragons that before they were tropes, we kind of muddled through. Because, for me, this was my first experience. So what did I learn? Always protect the healer. I learned that. Oh, yes, I did. The group bubble wrapped me. You stay over here. You stay well away from danger. Heal us when we need it. When I try to move up and fight, they'd be like, don't do that. And we never really needed it so much. Our group was quite offensively gifted. With the Bushai, the Cavalier, and the Samurai, that was a front wall few things could get through. Even when we were fighting a dragon. The Cavalier made a saving throw against fear, so he was able to stay up and fight. The Samurai ran away. I made my saving throw. I stood up, not next to the Paladin, or the Cavalier, because he was going to get breath weaponed by this green dragon, and I can't believe his horse didn't die. But I stayed up close enough where I could whack at it with my spiritual hammer, and then quickly move up and throw down a cure serious wounds, fall back. Cure moderate wounds, fall back. Dragon doesn't look like it's breath weaponing anymore. I can move up. There weren't attacks of opportunity back then. There weren't anything like that. So when the dragon's turn wasn't on, there weren't reactions. When the dragon's turn wasn't on, it was safe to move up, do whatever I needed to do. I can weather if the dragon attacked me or did a breath weapon, and I can fall back, no problem. So I can move up and just sit and stand there and heal battery him while he did the business end of taking on the dragon. The ranger shot it from a distance, and the others pitched in where they could. I do remember the ninja was pretty proficient with his bow too. So we did have some offense to help out, but most of them were scattered with the initial fear. So it was a pretty epic fight that I felt like I actually contributed in. It was so cool. One of the things that really got me into the game, feeling like my character was doing something and accomplishing something. But they kept me in, like I said, bubble wrap. Don't do anything to let the healer get in trouble. And I realized how important that was to early Dungeons and Dragons. Your spellcasters are an investment. You don't let them die, and when you need their help, they're there to protect you. They're there to heal you. They're there to do the area effect spells or the crowd control spells so you're not mobbed when the enemies get too big, or they're there with a clutch, powerful spell to knock down a more powerful foe that would be either tedious or too much for you as you get to higher and higher challenges. So I really appreciate that, but what really made it stand out was when, for some reason, the samurai and I were having crosswords, and the samurai impulsively decided to attack me, my cleric, that is, and everybody else in the group nailed him. Everybody. He got hit with 3 arrows, a magic missile spell, and the Bushai drew his sword and was ready to go. They're like, don't hit the healer. Really drove that point home. Also, don't split the group. That was another one that I learned right away. This was in Ravenloft too. One of the characters, the character of the samurai, the player loved samurai. He also loved vampires, and this is clearly way, way before anything like Twilight or anything. But there was still a subculture where vampires were kind of... I think this is even before... This is clearly before the World of Darkness storyteller stuff from White Wolf. I think this might have even been before the Anne Rice novels. And he still loved vampires. He loved the concept. He thought they were so cool and so powerful. And he had a samurai go run off to try to become a vampire from Strahd von Zarovich. Until the Game Master told him, if you do that, you are going to be surrendering to a clearly evil creature, and you guys have these things called honor points, and this will void out your honor points. You will have to commit seppuku before you actually get turned into a vampire. You can't actually do this, Mr. Samurai. And I remember that honor system, even though I've only, again, I've read that section of the Oriental Adventures book. It seemed like more punishment and gatekeeping of your activities, because you could increase it by little mustard grains, but boy, was it easy to just whoosh, one sour day, and you just feel like letting loose, and your honor could just go crashing down. And even little innocuous things, your DM can screw with you. Oh, have somebody steal something magical off of you? Even a potion. Minus 10 honor, just right there. Yeah, it was kind of brutal. I honestly really never got into that for a few reasons, and that was one of them. I didn't like feeling like I was controlled, although I had no problems playing lawful good, which some people consider the most straitjacketing alignment. But I didn't have any problems with not breaking the laws, and I didn't have any problems trying to be as good as possible, so it really wasn't a problem. But I learned always look up. We got hit with a trapper one time. Oh, that was ugly. Boy, that was the luckiest trapper ever. We barely got out from underneath it, and I think we had to run back to our hub town to rest and recuperate just from that stupid fight. The trapper had something going on where the floor ended up getting spiked. So the trapper was getting its food that much faster. And it smothered us, so we couldn't really fight back very well, and we were pressed into the spikes. But we did manage to kill it. We got out, and we had to fall back because we were all in really rough shape. Except for the Cavalier, who still had half his hit points left easy. Yeah. We also, a couple of the lessons that I really did learn was that you have to respect wizards because they suffer so much when they're low level. But they get so powerful at the end that eventually fighters become nearly superfluous. And I've learned and appreciated the interdependency of the different classes, why having an adventuring party is necessary, why Dungeons and Dragons does not make a good way to replicate Conan, at least most of the Conan books. I know the movie eventually came about Conan getting his ring of friends together, which worked pretty well, let's face it. There were some good stories within that. I especially liked Conan the Destroyer for the dynamics that you had there. The movie, that is. Because you had, of course, Conan, who was kind of your moral compass, which is weird. Conan being barbaric and everything, he was the best of the lot of them. Honorable and policed everybody and so on. You had Grace Jones's character who, showed that females could be kick butt, and she was awesome. Even though she just had her, I think, pointy stick, but she could whip it around. Oh, she was so good. I loved her character. She looked just so tough, and the comic relief between her and the princess. If you were interested in a man, what would you do? Grab him and take him. Awesome. The little thief, Malik, I think his name was the great cowardly thief. I have used that character as a template numerous times, and he never fails to be endearing and infuriating at the same time, especially with his willingness to go up and take credit for a victory he didn't do anything with. But still be that guy who, even though he can't do much, he will still stand there and he'll throw daggers to annoy things, and he will try, just not very effectively. He does not take the spotlight away from the players. I really enjoy that as a character. And, of course, having Wilt Chamberlain as Mbata? I think. Huge. Physically a match for Conan. And that huge spiked mace of his with the beak coming off of it and the counter looked like such a silly weapon, but at the same time, completely believable that in his hands that would be devastating. he was just physically this dominant force, and at the same time, when you knew he was going to eventually fight Conan, and when that happened, it was actually a pretty interesting mismatch. It wasn't a, say, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar versus Bruce Lee. It wasn't that. Where Bruce Lee himself had problems thinking about how he's ever going to get inside the guard of a man who was so much larger than him. No, the Conan versus Mvada was not that, but it was still a perfectly fine duel of two really big, powerful people going at it. Too short, unfortunately. I think a good, prolonged duel would have been fun, but things were going on at that time, so they couldn't really do that. And, of course, the wizard, Mako. Great wizard. I loved it in that he was a wizard the way Tolkien's wizardry worked. It was a lot of show. No. You tell the story. You don't actually put a lot of really crazy magic up on the stage. Hello, magic. You put her on your lap. It didn't do that. All of his magic was mostly invisible in what he knew, which was a really... No. You're not tackling my camera. It was a really cool way of doing it. And when he'd actually do magic stuff, it was hand gestures and then you saw stuff happen. He wasn't incanting long, complicated spells. He was basically using more psychic ability, it looked like, using some sort of telekinesis guided by his gestures as his magic. Obviously, with the special effects budget they had, they couldn't do anything much more than that, and that's fine. As far as practical effects, I was perfectly fine with it. And the character was much more important for what he knew, the spiritual side of things, to be the advisor of the group. Grumpy, yeah. He had a lot of personality. And I thought, Mako was a great person for that role. But as much as people thought that movie was cheesy and not very good for one reason or another, I thought it was really one of the greatest adventuring party movies on cinema. Obviously more come and go after that, but I thought, it held up pretty well against, say, the Heroes of the Lands from Chronicles, from Hickman and Weiss and Dragonlance series. You had strong personalities, and they blended together their talents and abilities, sometimes working counter with each other. That I thought made for really a pretty compelling story. Yeah, overall it was a little on the cheesy side, and the betrayal was so obvious that it really, most betrayal of obviousness. Yes, Conan, we're going to do this. Of course, everything. Trust the lady who dresses all in black and clearly just can't wait to rip the heart out of her niece or daughter or whatever. But all in all, and of course the fight at the end against Scalos is so disappointing. Rather cheesy. But it's fine. It's, for what it was fine. To me, it was about the camaraderie and the group. And, God, where am I going with this? Oof. That's a hell of a... I apologize. My mouth just started going and I lost complete pacing. But, yes. I'm betting half of you have never even seen Conan the Destroyer. Anyhow. I learned to appreciate that about a group and how you need people with different skills and different abilities. I seem to remember our Yakuza style handling the thieving stuff. I remember our samurai playing lawful stupid and ignoring the fact that this person seems to be very comfortable with breaking and entering, but he's still fine in my group, because we kind of had to do that. And that's been done many, many, many times in many, many, many groups. You have people who seem completely incompatible. It seems ridiculous that the fighter would travel around, or the samurai would travel around with some of us. But we made it work, and that was fine. It really didn't disrupt the game terribly until, well, the ninjas ended up killing the samurai, but he got better, and yeah, no. There were some weird things. Also, I learned how to that wishes can be extraordinarily nasty. At one point before I signed up with the group ended up getting a wish, and one person wished that they could have a dream night with the daughter of, if I can remember, it might have been Glacia, the daughter of Asmodeus or something like that. But, and it happened, it was a wish, so that happened. And then later on, we were in a mission where we went into the Sphere of Death, which is a very nasty demiplane, right on the border of the negative energy plane, where everything slowly becomes undead and is mostly populated with the undead. I think the Shadowfell kind of fits on that some extent, but this was more hardcore. And we're posing as undead of significant power. We were quite high-leveled at this time. And eventually, that character who made that wish ran afoul of Dad, who quickly turned him into lasagna. Just the wet remains of what was left he gave us as in a bag. So yeah, wishes. If somebody wishes for something as to be a jerk or to screw with your game, yeah, that's what you do. I learned that. And I'm not quite as hardcore on that now to make something like that necessarily, but all the same, I think that that did teach me a few things. It also did teach me that party harmony is a convention, and not one you can always take for granted, at least. For instance, the group really didn't want me to resurrect that character who died. They thought he had deserved it, and I'm like, we're in the middle of an adventure. We need everybody we can, and I can resurrect him right now. Because I could. And they're like, no, don't do it. And the character took the small bag that was all the parts of the character and stuffed it down his pants. It's like, no, you don't get his body. You don't get to resurrect it. And I'm like, I only need to know where it is. There, he's back. Now he's in your pants. Ha ha ha. We had teenage giggles at that. But, yeah. It was a good, solid group, and it did teach me a lot of things about what playing in AD&D was really like. It was the Wild West. It really was. No preconceived notions about what the game was outside of the instructional block. Oh, you are shedding, cat. Outside of the descriptive block of, this is what an adventure is like. Yeah, well, we followed that, but we took some shortcuts, and we took some liberties, and we basically made it our own game, just as many other people have done with Advanced Dungeons & Dragons since then. The rules were a guideline. We've used them for leveling up, we used them for, figuring out what our abilities did and all that. And then after that, we took to the modules, and I like to think that we use those as our guidelines too, but the Game Masters, the Dungeon Masters, had to frequently make up stuff wildly as we went along and rely on their other set of skills. I've since met people that remind me strongly of people from that very first group, but I do owe that group a debt of gratitude for really being the only the first of, I think, 2 campaigns that I've ever played in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. I did a lot more 2nd edition than I did 1st, and 2nd edition had a lot of quality of life improvements, so by the time I got to college and we started playing 2nd edition D&D, yeah, there were a lot of changes. But that first group still means a lot to me to this day, despite the fact that the names aren't fixed so firmly in my head. I can only remember 4 of them by name. And some of the members, were a little bit more ephemeral. The kids were a little energetic and not always focused on their characters. But it was still a good group. I had a lot of fun. And as I said, to this day, it still formed a lot of my game theory and my approach to role-playing. And now you've heard that, along with a really long-winded explanation of Conan the Destroyer. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. But I'm not going to edit that out. You get these. That's the risk you take when you watch my videos. And so I'd like to thank you for listening. If you're at all interested, these are some stories that I am not in contact with any of those players anymore, and I haven't been since I graduated from high school. Again, in the odd chance that somebody stumbles across this video who was a part of it, if I neglected your character, if I'm not going to mention you by name and give you credit, you'll forgive me, I trust. If you don't, I can't do anything about it. But I never use people's names. Very rarely do I use people's names, mostly to protect the guilty and innocent. So, until next time, though, I'm Rob. Thanks for joining me in the Lair of Omnisci. This has been another coffee with me with no coffee, but I did bring a little magic to the table. Right, Magic? Kitty loves me. So, until next time, thanks, and I will see you again next time. Farewell.